This is Identity at the Center. If it has anything to do with IAM, this is the go-to podcast. Now your hosts, Jim McDonald and Jeff Stedman.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
Good. I feel like my voice is a little hoarse. I just got done presenting a executive readout of a IGA roadmap, and jumped right over to do the podcast because the show must go on.
You talked for almost an hour straight. I think I clocked at one point 15 minutes without like a break at all. So, yeah.
Yeah, but there were points where I was like, does anybody have any questions? And of course, nobody had any questions. I was like, okay, I'll talk for another 10 minutes straight.
Yeah, so when that happens, I just say, yeah, I'm picturing roaring applause in my mind, and I just kind of go with that and just assume that everybody's loving what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Kind of like this podcast.
Yeah, exactly. Like you throw the podcast out there, and the only way you know if people are listening is if they go and give you a 5-star rating or go and subscribe to your YouTube channel. Are these subliminal hints working, do you think?
I hope so. I mean, those are cool. Or come up to us in conferences and things like that. I was at Identiverse in New York City last week. I think that was. I forget where I am this week. But I had somebody come up and ask me about that, which was kind of cool. It seems like for whatever reason, you're like the approachable one. Everyone comes up to you. And I don't know, maybe I just have like, resting bee face or something like that where nobody wants to come up and say hello.
I always wear my fancy suit jacket. So I think people a lot of times want to come up and say, whoa, that's a cool jacket.
Yeah. Hugh Hefner died and left you all his jackets, I feel like.
Yeah, exactly.
So we're starting some new things coming up here. And before we get to our episode, we're actually going to get into blockchain and identity and stuff like that. But before that, something that's coming up later this week that we're pretty excited to share is we're starting a new series of kind of podcast episodes, calling them Sponsor Spotlight for now. Basically, they're fully sponsored episodes that we've collaborated with different folks on. And the idea is to have a less vendor neutral conversation. This podcast is generally, we try to be as vendor neutral as possible, right? But sometimes we really want to get into like maybe a specific product or service or something like that. And this kind of, I feel like, gives us an opportunity. So it's extra content, doesn't replace our existing content. Does that make sense, Jim?
Yeah, it makes sense to me. I mean, honestly, I was thinking during that entire episode, like, this feels like a normal episode. So I have a feeling the sponsored spotlights aren't going to feel that much different. I think our listeners are the ones who benefit because it's just extra content. There was a little bit more of like, we always tried to stay very vendor neutral, and we had more leeway on the sponsored episodes. But actually, I think that can be beneficial because if we're talking to somebody from a sponsoring company, and they can say like, "Hey, this is how we solved that problem," that just I don't know. I don't get offended by that. I think that's actually pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think it just, like I said, we try to stay away from questions that would be like too salesy or too much of a commercial for folks. But these new episodes are not that. So I feel like I kind of mentioned it in the one that we've already recorded, like the shackles are off. It's like, hey, let's ask specific questions about this. Because that's the things that I want to know. I think that's kind of the intent is like, okay, how does this actually work? What does it take to do this sort of thing and get a little more detail around that versus just trying to be maybe abstract about it.
I kind of feel like the folks who want to do the Spotlight series, they want to be on the Identity at the Center podcast, right? They like the formula of what we do, which is educational and entertaining. And so I think folks, our listeners, if you just go out there and listen to a Spotlight episode and give us your feedback, like, do you like it? What else would you like to see? That'll help us, right? Just like this podcast in general, we started it and depended on the feedback because that told us what we were doing right and what was not so right.
Yeah, we are constantly building this car while we're driving down the street. And I think it'd be cool to get some feedback. So yeah, folks can check it out later this week. Probably going to drop these on Wednesdays or Thursdays, kind of off cycle from things. But curious to see what people think. So, get us feedback. Use LinkedIn. We've got the contact form on our website. We've got a new voicemail button that I've put on our website, idacpodcast.com. So if you go to our contact page now, there's a little thing that you can do to send us like a 90-second audio clip. And then from that, we'll use that on our show, theoretically, depending on how we get. But I'm curious if people want to send something to us, we can test it out and see how that works. But that'd be a good way to maybe send some feedback.
Now, are you concerned at all? Because I know we've always had the contact us link where somebody could type something in. And it feels like in the past month or two, since we really went crazy with getting all of our content up to YouTube, I'm getting a bunch of contact information from people who want to market our YouTube site and get us many more subscribers. And it's like, it's not about the number. It's about getting the information out there. So if we have like 500 subscribers, but it's people who really are loyal to the podcast, they're the practitioners of the world, as we like to say. I don't care. So those marketing things are, zero value to me, but I kind of look at them like spam.
Well, you're getting them because you didn't used to get them before. They would all come to me and I'd be like, nope. So I was acting as a filter, but no longer. Now we both get them at the same time.
Oh, thank you very much then.
Yeah, made some email infrastructure changes behind the scenes so that I wouldn't be a bottleneck so much. But yeah, you're seeing a lot more of the stuff that I would normally just filter out and be like, yeah, I don't need help building our YouTube channel. Like, that's not what this is about.
You know what else has been cool? I've seen a couple of posts where people are taking these Spotify videos that have been put out. So Ian Singh, he's been a loyal listener to the podcast for a long time. Apparently we're his number one podcast. I mean, I love the
Ian,
fact that he posted
Thank you so much, Ian, but that is so sad that anyone would pick an identity podcast as their number one podcast.
Well, yeah,
I'm flattered. That's very cool. I saw the same post you're talking about. Is this the Spotify Unwrapped, basically, for like podcasts? So
that's right. Yeah, and I actually got a link sent to me from Spotify that there are a lot of people where we're either their top podcast or their top 3 podcasts. So I feel really good about that because, again, we kind of started this as like we were calling it pirate radio, where it's like we'd get 25 downloads and know who those 25 were. That was over 4.5 years ago, something like that. Now we're at episode 250X.
Yep.
Is it 250 on the button?
250 on the dot, yep.
We should have done something special. Well, we did do something special.
We did do something special.
Yeah.
We're getting into a content that you and I think, have had interest in. I am a skeptic on this, so we're going to get into it in a second. The other thing that you mentioned about Spotify was I started adding like polls and like questions to it. So this is just something Spotify allows us to do. Can't really do it on any other platforms. So if you're not a Spotify user or listener of podcasts, then it's really you'll have to check it out there. But people have started to answer questions, leave comments and stuff like that. And Sean O posted a comment on episode 245, which I think that was Dave Middleton, where we're talking with him, and he really loved the show. So it was awesome. Can't wait to check out more, which is very cool because it's like, hey, we're, still reaching new people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And you know what I also think is like people who listen to the podcast or people who have been our guests, like wind up becoming our friends too. Like you see these folks in person, maybe for the first time, you're just like, oh, awesome. You really can connect. You just mentioned Dave Middleton. He was texting with me over the weekend because all the college football playoff games were happening, and I'm a Georgia Bulldogs fan, and our weekend didn't go so great. So
I have no idea what happened because I don't care.
Well, he sent his condolences to me, so I thought that was cool.
Well, he's a nice guy.
Fortunately for him,
singing voice too.
And he does. He does have a good singing voice.
Should we get into our main topic today?
Absolutely.
I think it's time. He's been making faces at us the whole time here on our recording studio. We said we were going to do something special. He's like, what? I'm here. Why don't we get into it? Because we really I'm thinking about the title here. It'll be kind of demystifying blockchain and identity. Definitely not cryptocurrency. That's not where this is going to go. But let me introduce to the show Jay Schulman. He's a principal and lead for the Blockchain and Digital Assets Practice at RSM US, one of our colleagues. Welcome to the show, Jay.
I couldn't be more privileged of being guest 250. So thank you for picking me for this occasion.
Yeah, high praise for sure. We appreciate you coming on here, and I kind of led off the fact that I feel like I'm a little bit of a skeptic. Not a little bit. I am a skeptic of blockchain and identity. We're going to talk about that, but first time on the show, we always like to find out about background. We were kind of talking before we hit the record button. It's like, okay, well, how did you get into the space of blockchain or identity or security, or what are you? Like, what space are
I'm
you?
old.
Like, how do you feel?
That's
your
what
background?
I'm old. I feel very, very old as I think about that introduction. So 20 something years ago, I started focusing on information security. I think, like Dave Middleton said, before it was even a thing, my parents asked me when I took my first InfoSec job, that's a full-time job? Which is amazing when you think about it today. 10 years later, around 2010, I got into identity, and before we hit the record button, what we were talking about how that happened. And I've always, and the theme I think you'll hear throughout this is, I've always tried to go where other people aren't. And it's really fascinating when you think about where identity was in 2010, because you'd say, well, Jay, that it was a thing back then. And it was amazing to hear about you guys just presenting on IGA. We definitely called it governance at that point, but I'm not sure IGA had been a moniker yet. I think about SailPoint was just governance. Avexa was out there, Tim and Tam. You want to think about what Okta looked like in 2010 versus what it looks like today. It's amazing to me, while I have left the identity space momentarily, probably. It's been amazing to watch what 10 years of innovation have done in the space. And I'm certainly proud of what I did back in 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013. But it's so cool to look back on that. And so I went back. I actually focused on another area, security, application security, spent a ton of time there. And I did a project back in early 2017 at an incredibly old financial services company that was implementing blockchain. And I'll be honest, I was skeptical then too. I was not born and bred for this. And we'll go into the details of it, so I don't want to preface that part. But I looked at the tech, and we'll talk about what the tech is and why I think it's legitimate. But I didn't think this was going to become of anything. And doing that project at this super old financial services company really showed me that there's value and that this was going to be a thing. And, we all worked together. Somebody at the company called me up and said, is this really a thing? Is this what you want to do? And I said, I think so. And they're like, all right, you're in charge. And here I am today. And I love it. But I also think that 10 years from now, we'll kind of laugh that there was a blockchain guy. Because I think, think back to 2000, and there was probably a person in charge of the internet, I run our internet practice. I just, that doesn't exist today. And I don't think blockchain will be a thing in 10 years either. But I'm super excited to kind of get into it, because I bet you're not the only skeptical person or people out there. And so hopefully you can represent all the skeptics as we go through it today.
I'm going to do my best. And you say in charge of the internet, I immediately go to the IT crowd and Moss and Roy pulling out the little black box for Jen, like, this Jen is the internet. And she's carrying it around with such reverence and things like that. I see, maybe that's blockchain in the future. I don't know. For the real geeks. So when I say I'm a skeptic, I feel like it's not because a technology skeptic, more of it seems like a really good solution in search of a problem. And I've been hearing and seeing about this for at least 5 years now. I remember seeing it at a conference several years ago. I was like, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, okay. 5 years later, one of the questions that I had recently in our Spotify poll was, have you set up a decentralized identity yet? Nobody has. So I think it's maybe still in that, early adopter maybe stage of things, but maybe we can get into that. But I don't want to lose people right away. So let's talk a little bit about blockchain itself. What is it? Can you kind of help me understand the identity components, especially of the blockchain?
Absolutely. And for anybody who is actually super deep in blockchain listening to this discussion is going to be hogwash to you. I'm actually going to try to think about this from an identity perspective. So somebody who is somewhere in their identity career and how they might think about blockchain. And it's kind of how I went and looked at it maybe in 2015, 2016 and said, I thought this was some dude in his basement who wrote all kinds of homegrown encryption code and it was going to be, a hot mess. What I found was something really similar to the way the internet works. It is really based on asymmetric encryption, public and private key pairs. And so when we think about the blockchain, it really represents, well, first, it's immutable. In 2017, I'll be completely honest, I'm not sure I knew what the word immutable meant. So I looked it up. ChatGPT didn't exist, so I couldn't quickly ask that. And it's a write once technology. And I think that is actually the use case. How much time do we spend as security professionals, as identity professionals, as investigators, making sure that the data that we have hasn't been changed? And so we have this technology that you can only write once. How do you do that? Instead of having a single repository, and I'll tell you, this is the absolute worst database in the entire world. Hands down. It is slow. It is written to text files. Like it's not even a real database. It is everything that you would hate about database technology is how blockchains work. But because it's slow is what gives it security and immutability. And that's the way it is built is a feature, not a bug. And so we have this copy that's spread all around the world. Bitcoin is the biggest blockchain. Again, we're not talking about cryptocurrency here today, but just quick example is there's 11,000 nodes, 11,000 copies, full copies of the Bitcoin blockchain spread all around the world. So as we think about data and data integrity, we're not talking about hot and cold backups and things like that. We're talking about this idea that 10,000 people are keeping copies of the same data that I have, and we're comparing them to each other. And that is really valuable. And so when we're talking about how the functions work, I, as the user of the blockchain, hold a private key. There is a public key representation that sits on the blockchain. And kind of what's different, and we can go into some analogies to other security things, but I think what's different is it's not just recording my public key, it can actually record other things about me. And certainly cryptocurrency, that I hold Bitcoin as an example, could be one of those things. But more importantly, any kind of metadata that you want, you can go record to a blockchain, whether that's a log, whether that's what my name is, or that some event happened. I went and climbed Mount Everest and I reached the top, and we're gonna memorialize that on a blockchain. There's a lot of really interesting use cases that I think we'll dive into, but that's a pretty simple example of it. It is exactly, if you've ever worked in client-side certificates, I hold the client-side certificate on my side of the blockchain. And the biggest difference here, and throughout my career, public key infrastructure was always something that clients inquired on, is it's a pain to make PKI work at scale. And I think the user interface in blockchain is horrible today, but there's so many people developing really high quality user interfaces in this perspective that I really think that we'll get to the point where blockchain might be described as public key infrastructure at scale. Does that make sense?
That's pretty interesting. So you brought up this immutable ledger, and to me that's what I always hear about the blockchain with the identity management conversation. And you said there's a lot of good use cases, and probably there's some use cases that aren't so good. But I guess, like, I hear about this immutable ledger. As an IAM practitioner, like, what does that mean to me? Where could I see that becoming a use case that actually I can wrap my arms around?
I think a lot of people, some of the early examples I had where they unplugged their database and plugged a blockchain in, and they're like, Jay, it doesn't work. I was like, no, That would be horrible to do. And I've also heard the example of, well, gosh, I could take all my log files and I could go write them to a blockchain. Wouldn't that make sense? And I don't think so. Again, let's think about it for a second. This is incredibly slow. The sole purpose is immutability. When we think about all the data in the world, I mean, I think the problem we have from a data perspective today is so much of it is throwaway. Where I think the use case is, let's narrow down to two things. Really important data. So I think about it from a financial transaction perspective. Do you care about all of the, $1 and $2 transactions that you have in your bank account? Not really. But do I care that I paid my mortgage or that I paid my car payment or some of these really important payments? Absolutely. So take that to a corporate perspective and you can see where they may have 1 million transactions, but they're only writing like 100 to the blockchain. And I think that's my mindset. So when we're thinking about identity, we're not writing every login and log out. We're not writing all of these things. Are we writing a password change? Maybe. Are we writing a privileged access successful login? That feels right to me. And there's some of these markers that I think that do make sense in this space. And that's how I think of it. I think one of the reasons that we see a lot of failed projects, and I think we saw these in identity too, is you're trying to do too much. If we just got these things smaller and simpler, we find a lot more success.
I'm just wondering if, we've had folks on this show talk about decentralized identity and self-sovereign identity. And I think one of the biggest actors in that, where that use case makes sense, is government agencies, where they can issue a credential. And not just government agencies, but anywhere that you're not kind of your typical corporate IDP environment where you change passwords and things like that. But let's take the digital driver's license, for example. It seems to me like the blockchain could play a valuable role in that. What are your thoughts there?
I think there's a lot of interesting use cases like that. But I also think that there's a role, while governments is a great example, I think there's a role for a corporation as well. So we all, at least personally, I want to be done with social security numbers. I actually want to be done with passwords too, if we're going to go argue about that. But how do I actually know who I am? Isn't a bank a great entity to go validate who I am? They've already done a ton of know your customer elements. They know everything. They know far too much about me. Can't they attest on the blockchain to who I am that allows, yes, governments to rely upon that too, but wouldn't it be nice to have a whole suite of corporations to rely on it? I think you could do this today. The question, I'm sure the skeptics would say, I could do that in a database. Like, that's nothing new here. I think it's the transparency that a blockchain gives that allows you to see a whole lot of what's going on, that gives you the comfort that when your bank goes and attests to these things, that it's something that I can rely upon. And that I think you have trouble doing that with a database.
So when you say the blockchain, is that a lowercase the or an uppercase the? Because this is one of the areas where I'm not sure how this is supposed to work. Because you mentioned banks have it. What about population of people who are unbanked? We say, well, the government blockchain. Okay, well, at least in the US, 50% of the population immediately is going to not want to use that, regardless of whoever's in charge, right? That kind of thing. So the blockchain means whose blockchain? Is it multiple blockchains? Is it really one blockchain to kind of rule them all? How do you see this working?
I think there are multiple blockchains. I think there are going to be multiple public blockchains. So blockchains that you don't need permissions to access. Everybody can just go and use them at will. And there'll be multiple private blockchains. So a group of companies get together to collaborate around some particular idea. And the only way that you can write to that blockchain is with specific access permissions. So it's definitely a lowercase t. And I think I compare this to the internet a lot because I think we see this same type of disruptive technology coming to fruition. And if we go back to when I started my career, way back, you can't see that I don't have any hair, but if you look me up, I don't have any hair. I didn't have any hair back then either. A lot of websites failed, right? They got billion-dollar valuations and they crashed and burned. So are there going to be blockchains that grow huge and crash and burn? Absolutely. Are there going to be ideas that start off looking really successful and fail? Absolutely. But there's also going to be ideas that kind of chug along for a while, and then you realize that they work really well, and they will become the next, whatever brand name internet company we want to quote right now.
So what happens when a blockchain fails? If I've been using that as my decentralized identity source or my, way to verify some sort of credential or something like that, right? If it fails, well, now what? The data's gone with it. Can I save it? Do I have to start over on a different blockchain?
So you probably need to start over on a different blockchain. This is a super complicated technical question, but that is one of the big considerations of building on top of these platforms is what's the long-term probability. And so you do see some centralization around a number of very big platforms because of that exact purpose. But I think that's a short-term thing that over time we will see that becoming less of a concern because we know which ones are going to be successful and which ones are not. I'd argue it's the exact same thing when you go pick an identity tool or a governance tool or any of these tools is, well, what happens if they go out of business? I got to go rip it out and put something new in. And so I don't think that the issue is that much different. It's probably a lot more impactful, though, to your end user, whereas you have a tough weekend of transitioning from one platform to another is a little different than ripping out, your decentralized identity.
I guess the closest thing that I can probably liken this to would be like switching password managers, except without maybe the benefit of being able to export and then import, right? Trying to go to each website and then figure out whatever credential I had. I don't know. I think I'm speculating here. What happens, I guess, is this something where organizations should be creating their own blockchain? Like if I wanted to start one, how would I do that? Or maybe this isn't something like a normal organization should be. Maybe it's, like you said, something's either finance related or maybe civic or government or maybe education. Like, do you see like any company, just name one, starting their own blockchain for their own purposes?
A lot of companies have started their own blockchain for their own purposes. I think, and I'm going to answer the question a little bit differently. Whether we're talking about companies or whether we're talking about individuals, I think everybody should be experimenting and understanding how this technology works. I don't think you should run out and go implement this and be a decentralized identity guru tomorrow. I think that would be a horrible mistake. But I do think that it's really important to understand how a blockchain works, how it might be applicable in the identity space, and play with it. And you can play with it in a public way, and I can give some examples of how to do that. Or you can spin one up in a private way too. And all the major cloud providers have a pretty easy template to go spin up a blockchain. Not to say that that's inexpensive for a personal person to do it, but there's a lot of ways to easily play with this stuff. And I think that is the most important thing. That's what's going to prevent you from making the big long-term mistakes. And you just become educated on it and you'll start to see the use cases yourself. I'm pretty confident in that.
So how do I get started with this? I guess, what are the building blocks here associated with if I do want to experiment? You mentioned templates, but can you talk a little about like what does it mean to set up a blockchain?
So I think the first place I would go to really quickly understand how this works, Ethereum is the second largest blockchain to Bitcoin. And Ethereum is much more like a decentralized cloud computing platform than anything else. And so you can run little programs on there and it's quite powerful. They have something called login with Ethereum. And that is the answer to passwordless logins or decentralized identity. There's probably a bunch of different ways that we could describe it, and none of them would do it justice. The idea there is, again, if we go back to that basic definition I started off with, I hold the private key, the public key is on the blockchain. I can go log into a website, present my private key and public key pair. Obviously, I'm not giving my private key away, for those who think I misspoke, and go log into a website. There is a full documentation suite. It's obviously all open source code. You can really look at not only how to do it yourself, but how a bunch of companies are using that technology. And then you're off to the races. You can go implement that, not, full production corporate world, but you can go implement that in a dev environment pretty easily yourself on a private blockchain. You can go experiment with your own website and having people log in that way on your own website. There's a whole lot of different things. And I think that's the best place to get started in thinking about it. And that, I think it's really well documented, and there's a great community behind it if you have technical questions and things like that to go try to figure this stuff out.
All right, I've got a couple questions here. The first is, I guess you mentioned Ethereum, and then you've got blockchain, and I know there's a whole bunch of other things out there, and I don't want to equivocate this with like cryptocurrency, right? But there's like Dogecoin and a whole bunch of other things. Is there a benefit or drawback to some of these blockchain styles, I guess? I don't know if that's the right word or not, for identity. Like if you're going to do something with identity, like Ethereum is the one to use. Or if you're going to do identity, whatever other template or style is the one that's probably the best fit. Or are there different styles of blockchains that maybe lend itself better to different types of identity use cases?
I'm going to try not to get too complicated or technical here with the answer, but Ethereum has been copied a ton of times. And so that mini decentralized computer is actually called the Ethereum virtual machine, or it's abbreviated a lot, EVM. And so a lot of blockchains are built on top of EVM, Ethereum virtual machine, which means they're actually all completely compatible with each other. So if you build login with Ethereum, you can actually reuse a lot of that technology to log into, or to use a different blockchain, because they are EVM compatible. There's probably a lot I could go into and get more detailed there, but let's leave it at that. So by building on top of that style blockchain, it really allows you to extend the possibilities. Absolutely, each blockchain is going to be different. And I think over time, what we're going to find is blockchains will have maybe not a singular purpose, but a really small number of purposes. And so do I think there's going to be an identity blockchain in the future? Absolutely. Do I know which one it's going to be today so that you guys could all run out and figure that out? I don't. And anybody who says that they do, there's some theories on which one's going to be the media, where video and music and things like that are stored. I'm not sure which one is going to be for that either. So it's again, I think you put it correctly. We're still in the early adopter phase, and we have to kind of figure this stuff out.
Who benefits from controlling the blockchain? So if I am setting up if I'm one of these companies maybe that specializes in blockchain, and I decide, hey, I'm going to create this thing that does X, what benefit is to me to own? I don't think you can really own the blockchain, but maybe there is some component of it. But who benefits from being the owner of a blockchain?
The end user. And I think that is the hard part for a lot of different stakeholders to get their head around. So today we have a lot of centralized data, and we have a lot of security breaches, and we have, a whole bunch of issues all around that. And the whole idea of implementing a blockchain is changing the paradigm away from the centralized data store and pushing it out to where each individual owner owns their data. As I say this, for those of you who have spent time in PKI, you're going to say, that's great, Jay, but the end user is going to go lose their private key, and then all their data is lost too. And I think that is in fact where we need to get to. That's the gap of where we sit today, and what the future looks like is not only the user interface and the tooling to make it work, but it's it's kind of understanding that process and making sure that the user is bought into it. There's absolutely an argument that most users don't want to own their own data. I'm not sure that I fully believe that. I think given the choice, a lot of users would own that data if they had the right tools to hold on to it. And I think about my less than technical mom. No offense, Mom, if you're listening to the podcast today. You have to include them in the use case here, and I think that's where it gets hard, right? Mom needs to be able to own their own data too.
The end user is the benefit. I get that part of it, but what's in it for me as a entrepreneur in the space? How do I make money off this running a blockchain? Or is this a loss leader of some sort, or is that really not a viable, I guess, strategy to build a business of creating blockchains and rely more on public funding or something like that?
I don't want to get too deep. There's a whole lot of different theories on the economics of it. I think most importantly, you need to have sound economics behind it. But there's a lot, there's the old expression, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. And that's the paradigm that blockchain changes, which means it also changes the monetization model. And there's a lot of different companies trying a lot of different monetization models here. Again, early adoption phase, I don't know exactly how this is going to work. The one that strikes me that's really interesting from that identity and the identity proofing model is if my bank is going to proof me and write that to a blockchain, then I'm probably going to pay my bank to do that. And then you can start to see where there's a whole lot of new services that pop up. Today, when I go to onboard with a company, they're paying the fee to proof me versus me paying the bank to proof me and then being able to use that all over the place. That's the paradigm changing that I'm talking about. And yeah, that's I'm used to getting something for free that I now have to pay for. So I could see where that end user is like, wait, why do I want to pay for this? But I also think that they'll see a ton less friction if I only have to do that once and I can reuse that proofing all over the place versus having to go reproof every single time. If potentially your next question is, well, why would a company want to do that? Less expenses of having to do proofing. And from what I've seen for the past 15, 20 years, friction is still a huge factor in onboarding a new user. We got to keep that friction down. And if I can rely on somebody else's proofing to reduce my friction, that's going to get more customers on my platform where I can then interact with them and solve them or whatever the platform does.
Yeah, I've mostly been listening here and learning a lot. And it was interesting when I think Jeff was talking about, well, how would I get started? I was expecting you to maybe say, hey, you go out and check out some of these services that Microsoft is starting to create, like around the Web 3.0, around Microsoft Entra Verified ID. Jay, I'm totally talking way out of my element here. Can you even, based on what I just said there, can you give us kind of a high-level explanation of what those pieces are and whether or not that's something that people could get into to start, using blockchain to build applications? Maybe those are identity applications.
I think that this is that paradigm change. Is I'm not going to go to the big cloud providers and go sign up for a service. I absolutely can go spin up a blockchain over there. But if I'm going to go build, I'm probably going to build on something that already exists. And almost everything in the space is open source. And I want to remind you, if we go back to 1997 or 2000, a lot of the internet was open source too. And that's where I find these similarities. And so what would I have recommended in 1997? Go learn HTML, go set up a website, and go play with this and try to see what you're going to do. And you're going to build on top of open source. That's kind of the same thing I'd recommend somebody today. Log in with Ethereum is a great example of an open source construct that there's many possibilities that you'll see when you get in there. And that's actually a great place to start, even if your goal isn't identity, because you'll see all the interconnections and you'll be able to find whatever it is that you ultimately want to build. But this is bringing us back to our open source roots. And I think that's hard to believe sometimes when you see a lot of commercial enterprises deep in this space, but the reality is that it's open source at its core.
Jay, you mentioned you were old.
Thanks for reminding me.
Reminding you of that. No, but I've heard you speak several times, and when you talk about blockchain and identity, you bring up PGP, which is like a thing of the past, right? Why is that even relevant to this subject? And what is PGP?
Pretty good privacy. Back in 2000, when I wanted to go send an encrypted email to somebody, I would encrypt the email with PGP and send it with my private key. And they'd use my public key to decrypt it, much like we do in blockchain, if that sounds familiar, amongst many other things for that matter. And it was clunky and painful. It worked, man. It worked really well. But part of the problem was always, how do I know it's really Jay on the other side of this message? And so there was the PGP key server. And it's amazing to me that 24 years ago, that was still housed at MIT, and it is still housed today. And I bet you can find, my 23, 24-year-old public key sitting on that server. But there's also something part of that was the web of trust. And that was the idea that three of us are on a podcast together. And I'm like, guys, this is really my public key. And you vouch for me and say, yep, I've met Jay in person. This is really Jay's public key. I'm going to co-sign the key so that you can see that it's real. And obviously, the more people that validate that you're real, the higher up your trust level goes. And I look at that, and brilliant in its time, and kind of left behind as a lot of the capabilities around encryption and SSL and a whole bunch of other things, SAML and all these things come to fruition that allow us to do that process a lot easier. But honestly, what's old is new again. I feel like there are people building on top of that philosophy using a blockchain. And I think that it's important to think about some of these failed experiments from the late 90s and early 2000s and revisit them in light of new technology. And that, that's going to be true of AI and a whole bunch of other new things that are coming out as well. But it goes to show you, back to the first comment you had, Jeff, is this a solution looking for a problem? It takes time for these to develop. And I'm confident that when we look back over time, blockchain's one of those things that holds up. And it'll be interesting to see what very dated, old, balding technology actually reappears now in the age of blockchain and AI and a bunch of other new technologies.
I kind of feel like what we generally do with new technology and identity is try to map it to a real world use case where we don't have technology. We have driver's licenses, and we go to the liquor store, and that person just wants to see that we're of age to buy their product, etc. So you have like this issuer and relying party. And so we tie that concept back to this. And now I'm thinking about that I'm the internet practice manager. I run the internet consulting practice. And I think if you were in that role, you would have said, and by the way, the internet does not have a construct for identity, for how you identify yourself. And that's kind of one of the core problems that we've been trying to solve forever. And I don't know that there is a parallel, real world use case that maps to how you do it on the internet. So you're talking about this web of trust in the PGP world where other people wind up attesting to you. I think the parallel is that's the blockchains that attest to you. I think that's a pretty fascinating concept, but that's probably why it's hard for people to wrap their brain around this kind of approach. Do you think?
I think your example really resonates with me, because we added passwords and we said, gosh, that's the end game, right? Passwords work. We've secured everything. And then it turned out passwords aren't that great. And we said, okay, two-factor. And we've tried a whole bunch of different kinds of two-factor, right? YubiKeys, again, really, really secure, but pretty clunky. Text messaging, really easy, but not necessarily that secure. And again, at each one of those steps, we kind of say, hey, we solved the problem. And we kind of stay that way until something else better comes along. And I think that is, in fact, the best analogy, where a lot of these things we think are solved, when in fact something better is being built and developed that will at some point realize, this is better than a password, this is better than two-factor, and we kind of move on. I mean, I think about 2005 doing access reviews, and man, like there are definitely some companies out there that thought they had nailed access reviews, and they had the fanciest Excel spreadsheets, and man, they were on top of their game. And then the sale points and effects come around, and it's like, whoa, this we could do this a whole lot better. And then you look at where we are today, and there's a lot more automation underneath it to make these things work better. And I think that's the piece. We don't know it's coming, or we don't think it'll work because of our pre-existing thought process. But when it actually comes time to use it, it's better. And that's hard. And I don't think that's unique to blockchain. It's certainly not unique to identity. And I honestly think, not to make, go on an AI rant, but I think we're going to have a really hard time with AI for that exact reason. Oh, you're going to tell me that AI can do an access review? No way. And somebody's going to implement AI on top of a governance platform in a really unique way, and they're going to kill it, man. And I think that's hard to see as it's coming, but once it gets here, you kind of see the whole perspective.
So given all that, PGP, pretty good privacy, pretty good kind of hints at the idea that it's not perfect. Jay, is PGP pretty good?
It's pretty good.
That's the big moment of the podcast for today.
There's our teaser.
Drop the mic.
The shortest teaser ever. Jay, I want to ask you about some of the applications of blockchain in the identity management space. Is there a blockchain tool for identity? Is there a tool built on it already today? Are there other features, maybe like LDAPs or graph databases or things like that, where there are parallels that exist?
So all the graphs and other repositories are going to be built on top of blockchain. Again, horribly, horribly slow on purpose. And so that is one of the, gosh, why am I doing it this way? If I'm going to go pull all the data off the blockchain and go put it into a graph to go access it better. But again, the immutability is the reason that you're doing it. So login with Ethereum is probably the beginning stages of a full identity suite. But again, I don't look at this as let's go log into a website. I don't think that's the use case here. I think, and let's weave in AI, because I'm usually the guy that can drop 100 tech buzzwords in a 45-minute podcast. How do I know that? And my daughter and I had a fun time listening to AI generated music. And is this the real artist, or is this the AI artist? And it was a good time. We had a good time doing it. But there's a lesson here in, not do I want to know whether this is real or not, but creating AI music is in fact a skill set that I want to get credit for that. So how do we identify the AI artist, whether that's music or video or a picture? And so we're going to be entering an area where identity is going to look a little bit different, and it isn't going to be the common username and password, email, address, and things like that, where blockchain identity may not actually replace LDAP. It may not replace all of the OAuth and all the different types of identity we do today. It may actually fill a new niche of being able to identify some of these non-traditional types of users, or or entities, right? Authenticating a bot in a unique and definitive way. So that there's, again, kind of a new world of the internet that we're going to face. And I think that the blockchain identity is, in fact, concentric circles versus replacing some of the existing technology that's out there.
Sounds to me like time is a flat circle for all you True Detective fans out there. So one of the things that I think vendors in, well, really any space, but the identity space, like to attach their products to whatever wave is cool at the moment, right? We saw a whole bunch of zero trust marketing over the last few years. When vendors come along and say, oh, we have a blockchain product, what do you think they're really trying to get to? And I know this is probably a little more speculative, but I feel like there's a lot of marketing speak out there to say, oh, we have the best zero trust XYZ. Oh, we have the best blockchain XYZ. Like, what do you think vendors are thinking about in the technology space around this?
I mean, this is why it is so important for people to go play with the tech and understand it in a controlled, research-oriented mindset. Because when the vendor shows up in the room and says, now with blockchain inside, with a little sticker on the box, you want to be able to ask the really thoughtful questions that get to how are you using it, why are you using it, what are you actually doing? And so I can't speculate, and I'm sure there's going to be 100 different answers to those questions across the vendor ecosystem. But if you're not armed with that first layer, I've touched it, I kind of understand enough to ask the good questions, you are kind of left in the dark with marketing speak. And I think we saw in 2017, 2018, a ton of the built with blockchain. I think that's gone away a little bit. And we're seeing a lot more thoughtful inclusion of blockchain in vendor products. And so I don't want to say that everything's perfect, but we're getting to a better place where it's a lot more thoughtful than it has been in the past. And I think that's just part of I'm sure we saw the same thing with zero trust, right? Everybody puts it on the cover, and now we're probably to a better place where it's used more judiciously.
Yeah, I was at RSA, I don't know, a couple of years ago, and I came back. My report was, to the podcast crowd, good news, zero trust has been solved. Every product now has it part of their, solution set or features, so everything's good now. You mentioned, I thought it was kind of interesting when you're talking about, I guess, with your daughter trying to figure out AI music versus regular music, right? What was the kind of the artist? It's clear, obviously, generative AI is kind of taking over. It's having a moment right now. And I think there's a lot of people who talk about ownership and rights and things like that, and being able to verify that, this is authentic. Certainly, I can see the benefits of having something like an immutable ledger out there that kind of tracks this. But then I also hear things like NFTs, which get a bad rap as well, right? I'm selling a picture of, I don't know, Bored Ape, right? Or whatever those are, right? For tens of thousands of dollars or even millions of dollars. And I guess, how do we balance the two to make sure that we're really not getting too crazy with how we're trying to leverage this?
Yeah, and I'm going to come at it from the other side, because I think if we assume everything is fake, then I want to know what is real. And that leads me to, how do I know that what I'm looking at came behind the lens of a camera? And yes, I think we need to authenticate all the AI generated content. Me personally, I'm not terribly excited about reading a book that was completely generated by a computer. I think there's some value in a human being having written a book. And so I think at some point you're actually going to authenticate that this is a human generated. What percentage of this book was generated by the author human being? But let's take that picture for a second. And there's, if this were a video, this will encourage you guys to do more video podcasts. There's a picture of Jared Leto at the Met, dressed up in this, I think it was a bunny costume. And when you look at the picture, it actually looks AI generated. It looks fake. It turns out it's real. It's a real photo. And so having that authentication that this came off of a Canon or a Nikon or a Leica camera is going to be hugely beneficial. There's actually a standard that A lot of the camera manufacturers and others have created C2PA. If you want to go Google for that, that is a really interesting standard. That, by the way, anchors itself to a blockchain. I found it fascinating to look at kind of how that standard gets implemented. And there's a camera from Sony, a camera from Leica. I think there's a camera coming out from Panasonic. And like, if we compare this to LDAP, everybody's implemented the standard just a little bit differently. So it will be interesting to see, what this looks like in a few years. But again, you can see the identity of the camera person, the identity of the camera, the identity that they were standing in this place and actually hit the shutter button and took that picture is going to be valuable. And I think the genesis is that photographer will likely get a higher fee for that piece of artwork because it was real versus completely AI generated. I pay $1 for an AI generated sunset. I'm just throwing out fun numbers here. I pay $10 for a real sunset taken by a photographer.
Interesting conversation, but I also think that over time, the nature of art is going to change. I mean, I look at things people create in Photoshop or, some of the computer-generated video. I'm just blown away. That's real art. There was some human behind the scenes, but of course, there's a lot of technology brought to bear as well. I can see, potentially in the future, people don't just deal with paintbrushes and canvas, but actually they use some kind of like virtual painting and, it probably feathers out the paint and things like that. That doesn't mean that it wasn't human created art. Just that doesn't counter anything that you just said, but it just got me thinking that I think the nature of what we consider human generated will change over time.
Let me add on something to that where there's a good example of that paradigm shift I was talking about. What if Photoshop was free and the art that you created with it, they got a cut of that art? That's really hard to do today. There's no way to do it, right? It's just trust, like that you're going to give them 10% of whatever art you create. If we anchor these pictures to a blockchain and Photoshop has an identity and I have an identity, and when I sell that photo, that there's some automation behind it that gives Photoshop their 10% cut and I get 90% cut. Now that's a completely different dynamic. And I think that's what is exciting to me about blockchain technology is that's really hard to implement. Today, Adobe would never enter that market where they're giving away this product in the hopes of getting some artistic return. But if we can actually put some contracts on a blockchain that enables that, that's really interesting and that's really exciting. And that, Jeff, going back to what are the economics that make it work, that's why it's hard to predict, what the right economics of running a blockchain is. But you could see that that's a good example of an interesting model that some upstart AI image company might choose. We'll just take a cut.
I feel like my head is spinning a little bit because we went into this with trying to demystify this. I think we've done a good job with that, but I think there's still so many questions that are just kind of like, how is this going to work, right? Where is this thing going? If you had to put on your prognosticator cap on, what do you think blockchain looks like as like a market and sort of like an industry in 2 years from now?
So first, I think I need to come back on episode 300 to do a follow-up to this episode. I'm just going to throw that out there right now. I think we actually talk less and less about blockchain. I think it becomes this boring thing at the bottom of the tech stack that enables some stuff that we kind of just forget about. I actually think that blockchain will be most successful when we don't think about it. How often do we have really deep conversations about LDAP? We don't. It's just there. It kind of works and we take it for granted. And is that going to be in 2 years' time? I think we'll start to be on the road. I definitely think that the retail user probably doesn't think about blockchain very much, even when whatever product they're using actually uses a blockchain. Now, does that mean IT people and identity people? Yeah, we'll obviously still be in the middle of all of it, but I would hope that this is not a front and center thing. I do not think the sticker on top of the box that says now with blockchain inside is actually going to be that exciting. It's really the ultimate use case of being able to get a product for free and they just take a cut of whatever I develop with it. That is going to be the front and center value that you may ask, hey, how did they do this thing? But the reality is we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about it.
Well, we're hitting here an hour, and I want to wrap up the conversation with a little bit of a lighter note. You mentioned one experiment that you were running with your daughter around the AI music. We were talking before we hit record about another one that you were working on regarding eggs and coffee. You want to care to explain yourself, Jay?
So I got 3 daughters, just in case anybody's confused at home as to what's going on here. My oldest daughter and I share a lot of music, and so we were listening to that. The middle daughter is working on an interesting science experiment. I hadn't thought about this before. We are taking eggs and dyeing them with coffee. I will pause for a second and say, gosh, why did she pick coffee? She has this strange feeling that she's going to get to drink coffee during this experiment. So that's how she picked coffee. And we're testing a cold cup of coffee, a room temperature cup of coffee, and a hot cup of coffee to see which one is going to dye the darkest. And that is everybody asks me, so what's on tap this weekend? That is what is on tap this weekend.
So that's coming up. We're going to have to look for an update to see, do you have any theories or posits that you want to put out there and say, we think that this might hold true?
I mean, I'll be honest, I asked ChatGPT what the AI bots of the world thought, and I learned all about the pores of an eggshell. And when when the temperature of the liquid is hot, it opens up the pores and allows more dye to come in. I'm pretty sure the cold coffee is not, it's probably going to be pretty light. I'm really curious where lukewarm falls in the spectrum, so I'm still going to be surprised here. But I'm really curious why no egg dyeing company at Easter recommends warm or dare I say hot dye for their eggs, and that it may be that there's some real world applications of our little science experiment, and I can report back exactly how we should be dyeing eggs in the springtime.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is, what we typically do is put out like a little teaser. And so when I tag you on LinkedIn on Monday when this comes out, I'll be looking for an update to say, so which one was it? Was it the hot coffee that got the pores open? Which, hey, logical, makes sense, right? That's how humans work. I guess, what is the temperature that allows the pores to open enough, right? Maybe there is a big difference between cold and lukewarm. Maybe not so much difference between lukewarm and hot. I don't know. I'm not an eggologist or whatever.
I will put my risk management hat on for a second. And for those of you who are at home who might have a young child who's going to stick their hands in boiling hot water, probably not the best idea. And so I highly recommend you check the temperature of your dyes before choosing to dye an egg. And so that's my disclaimer of the day.
That's Identity Center for you. Safety first at all times. Jim, have you ever done anything like that with your kids, with like any sort of like scientific experiments or anything like that? I don't have kids, so it'll be difficult for me to do that.
I'm sure I have, but it's been a long day and I actually don't remember what they were. But, I spent a lot of time with my kids, like trying to fix things. And, I'm not the most handy person in the world. My father was like, he'd get out under the car and replace the brakes and do all these like crazy things. And then I became an adult, got into computers, and now I can't change brakes on a car. But my son is now 19 and he got a motorcycle and he's like taking it apart and fixing it. I'm like, I guess that gene kind of skipped me because he seems to have it. I don't know where that came from. But not a lot of science experiments.
Okay. Well, other than this podcast, we'll call that, this is our experiment. See how this goes.
What are you doing on the side, Jeff? Are you doing science experiments?
I am always tinkering. I would say computer science experiments. How about that? what's a better way to use, this tool or that tool? How do we make the podcast better, or things like that? I'm always tweaking stuff behind the scenes.
Yeah, no, and you do a great job with that.
Well, thanks for that. I think that's a good spot. I always like hearing compliments, and that's how we'll close the show out today. So, Jay, thank you so much for taking the time with us. I know you're a busy guy, but we definitely want to have you come back on and be looking for an update on the egg experiments on Monday when this goes live, and hopefully we'll see you there. We'll have a link in our show notes for people to connect with you if they have questions about this, or if they want to tell you you're wrong or you're right, or what maybe people are seeing in the market, etc. Obviously, please be respectful. And with that, we'll go ahead and leave it for this week. We're on the web, idacpodcast.com. Try out our new voicemail feature. You might get on the show if it's something we think we can use for that. We're on Twitter at IDAC Podcast, Mastodon, decentralized, at IDAC Podcast, at infosec.exchange. And of course, Jim and I are always looking for feedback on LinkedIn, especially for these new sponsor spotlight episodes that we're going to come out later this week. So let us know what you think, what works, what doesn't work. We want to hear it all, because the goal here is to put out something that we think is worth our time and your time listening to it. So with that, thanks everybody for listening, and we'll talk with everyone in the next one.
You've been listening to Identity at the Center. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review. And we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit the website at identityatthecenter.com and find us on Twitter at IDAC Podcast. See you next time on Identity at the Center.